The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor burned bright, but the air was thick with tension. Elena Hart stood near the tall oak doors, her hands folded in front of her, while sharp voices argued in 3 different languages across the long table. She had been called here at the last hour, summoned by a letter that gave her no time to prepare, only an address and a warning that the fate of an important trade agreement rested on getting the words right. She had walked into the manor expecting a simple job. She did not expect to be judged before she even opened her mouth. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe sat at the head of the table, his back straight, his eyes cold. He looked at Elena the way a man looks at an unexpected stain on his coat. She wore a plain gray dress, sensible shoes, and her dark hair was pulled back without a single decoration. Everything about her said she had come from nothing, and everything about him said he had never once needed to explain himself to anyone. "This is the translator?" he asked, not to her, but to his steward, as though she were an object left on the wrong table. The steward, a nervous man named Edmund, cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Grace, Miss Hart comes highly recommended." "Recommended by whom?" the Duke asked. His voice was flat, almost bored, but there was an edge underneath it that made the room grow quiet. "Look at her. She cannot possibly follow what is being discussed here. This negotiation involves the finest minds from 3 nations. I asked for a professional, not a girl from the village." Elena felt her face grow warm, but she did not look away. She had heard worse than this before, from people who thought a woman with rough hands and a simple dress could not possibly hold a sharp mind behind her eyes. She had learned long ago that anger wasted breath, better spent proving people wrong. "Your Grace," she said calmly, "I was told my task was to translate, not to be admired." A few of the foreign guests seated at the table exchanged glances, unsure what had just been said, since the exchange had happened in English at a speed too fast for them to follow. The Duke's eyes narrowed at her response. He was not used to being answered, especially not by someone he had already decided did not matter. "You may sit at the end of the table," he said, waving a hand toward a chair far from the center of power, "and try not to embarrass this household any further than you already have." Elena walked to the chair without a word. She did not slam it against the floor. She did not sigh loudly enough to be heard. She simply sat down, straightened her spine, and waited. The trade negotiation had brought together 3 delegations. The first was French, led by a stern woman named Madame Correth, who represented a shipping company looking to expand into English ports. The second was a small group from Russia, led by a merchant named Yuri Sokolov, who wanted access to English wool at a fair price. The third delegation, and the most difficult of the 3, had come from a trading house in China, led by a quiet but sharp-eyed man named Mr. Lin, who spoke almost no English at all. The Duke's own translator, a young man named Charles, had been hired only weeks earlier. He was skilled enough in French, adequate in Russian, but he had never studied Mandarin, and it showed the moment Mr. Lin began to speak. Mr. Lin spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, but Charles's face went pale as he tried to catch even a single familiar sound. He turned to the Duke, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Grace, I believe he is speaking about the shipping routes, but I cannot be certain of the details. His accent is different from what I studied." The Duke's jaw tightened. He looked toward Mr. Lin, who waited patiently, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Madame Corrette tapped her fingers against the table, clearly annoyed at the delay. Yuri Sokolov leaned back in his chair, watching the scene with quiet amusement, as though he expected the whole meeting to collapse before it truly began. "Say something," the Duke muttered to Charles. "Anything reasonable." Charles opened his mouth, but no useful words came out. He stammered through a guess, mixing up numbers and dates, and Mr. Lin's brow furrowed with visible confusion. Whatever Charles had said, it was clearly not close to correct. It was at this moment that Elena rose from her chair. She did not ask permission. She simply stood, walked to a spot near the center of the table, and spoke directly to Mr. Lin, in fluent, careful Mandarin. Her tone was respectful, her pronunciation clear, and within seconds, Mr. Lin's confused expression melted into surprise, and then into something close to relief. The Duke stared at her, as though she had suddenly grown a second head. Mr. Lin responded, speaking a little faster now that he understood someone in the room could truly follow him. Elena listened, nodded, and then turned to the table and translated his words into smooth, natural English. explaining exactly what shipping routes he was proposing, and why the timing mattered for the coming season. Before anyone could recover from the shock, Madame Corrette interrupted in rapid French, clearly frustrated that the conversation had moved without her input. Elena turned toward her without missing a beat, answered in equally fluent French, assuring her that her concerns would be addressed next, and asked her to clarify one point about the shipping fees. Madame Corrette blinked, surprised, then answered the question directly, her irritation fading into curiosity. Yuri Sokolov, watching all of this with growing interest, made a comment in Russian, meant as a private joke to his companion, clearly not expecting anyone at the table to understand him. Elena glanced toward him, allowed herself the smallest smile, and gave a brief, polite reply in Russian that made his companion laugh out loud and made Yuri himself sit up straighter in his chair. The room had gone from chaos to calm attention in the space of a few sentences. The Duke sat frozen at the head of the table, watching Elena move between three languages as easily as breathing. His mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. This was the woman he had dismissed as unfit to be in the room. This was the woman he had told to sit quietly and not embarrass his household. Elena continued working through the discussion, translating questions and answers back and forth, keeping the conversation moving smoothly, catching small misunderstandings before they could grow into larger problems. When Madame Corrette used a phrase that could have been taken as an insult if translated too literally, Elena softened it carefully, keeping the meaning honest but the tone respectful, preventing what might have become an unnecessary argument. At one point, Mr. Lin asked a question that required knowledge of a fourth language entirely, quoting an old trading term originally written in German by a previous business partner. Without hesitation, Elena explained the term's meaning, translating it smoothly into both English and Mandarin so that everyone in the room understood exactly what was being referenced. By the time the meeting reached its natural pause, nearly 2 hours had passed, though it felt to everyone present like far less time. The three delegations had reached a rough understanding on shipping routes, pricing, and delivery schedules, something that had seemed nearly impossible only a short while earlier. Madame Corrette rose first, offering Elena a respectful nod. "You have saved this meeting from failure," she said in French, and Elena translated it for the room, without adding anything to soften or inflate the compliment. Yuri Sokolov stood as well, raising his cup in a small toast toward Elena, saying something warm and appreciative in Russian, which Elena translated with a modest smile. Mr. Lin bowed slightly toward her, a gesture of genuine respect, and spoke a few final words in Mandarin before gathering his papers. Elena translated simply, "He says he looks forward to working with people who listen carefully." Throughout all of this, the Duke had not said a single word. He sat very still, his eyes moving from one delegate to the next, then finally settling on Elena. His earlier certainty had cracked completely, and in its place was something he was not used to feeling: doubt about his own judgment. As the guests began to gather their things and prepare to leave for the evening, Elena quietly returned to her seat at the end of the table, folding her hands in her lap, just as she had done at the very beginning. She did not seek out praise. She did not look toward the Duke for approval. She simply waited, calm and composed, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The Duke finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "How many languages do you speak?" Elena looked at him directly, her expression steady, neither proud nor humble, simply honest. "I speak 6 languages, Your Grace." The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy, landing far harder than any raised voice could have. The Duke opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to say. Elena rose from her chair, gathered the small bag she had brought with her, and walked toward the door without waiting to be dismissed. She paused only once, near the threshold, and looked back at the room full of powerful men and women who, only hours earlier, had underestimated her completely. "If you need me for the next session," she said simply, "you know where to send the letter." And with that, she walked out into the cold evening air, leaving behind a room full of silence, and a Duke who was only beginning to understand how badly he had misjudged her. Outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the last light of day fading behind the hills that surrounded the manor. Elena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began the long walk back toward the village, her mind still turning over the events of the evening. She had grown used to proving herself again and again, to walking into rooms where people assumed the worst simply because of how she looked or where she came from. It had stopped surprising her a long time ago. What surprised her tonight was how deeply the Duke's dismissal had stung, more than she expected, more than she wanted to admit even to herself. She thought of her mother, waiting at home in the small cottage at the edge of the village, too weak now to do more than sit by the window and watch the road. It was for her mother that Elena had taught herself French from old books borrowed from a kind neighbor, then Russian from a traveling merchant who stayed in their village one winter, then Mandarin from a patient trader who visited twice a year and enjoyed teaching in exchange for company during his long stay. She had built her skills piece by piece, out of necessity and stubbornness, never once imagining that one day those same skills would humble a duke in his own hall. As she walked, the cold wind bit at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts were already moving ahead, toward tomorrow, toward whatever letter might or might not arrive from Ashcombe Manor. She did not know yet whether tonight's work was the end of her involvement or only the beginning. She did not know that behind her, in that grand hall, the Duke remained seated long after everyone else had gone, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, turning her words over in his mind, again and again. "I speak 6 languages, Your Grace." He had built his entire life around being the smartest person in every room he entered. Tonight, for the first time, a young woman with rough hands and a plain gray dress had proven him wrong, without raising her voice even once, and somewhere beneath his wounded pride, a small and unfamiliar feeling was beginning to stir, one he did not yet have a name for, but one that would not let him rest easily that night. 3 days passed before any word came from Ashcombe Manor, and in that time Elena returned to her ordinary life, tending to her mother, mending a torn dress by candlelight, and teaching a young boy from the village his letters in exchange for a basket of eggs each week. She did not speak of what had happened at the manor to anyone, not even to her mother, who noticed the faraway look in her daughter's eyes but chose not to press for details. Elena had never been one to boast, and she saw no reason to start now over a single evening that might never be repeated. On the 4th morning, a rider arrived at the edge of the village, his horse breathing hard from the fast pace. He asked for Elena Hart by name, and when she stepped outside to meet him, he handed her a sealed letter bearing the crest of House Ashcombe. Her heart beat a little faster than she wanted to admit as she broke the seal and unfolded the thick paper. The letter was short and formal, written in a hand that was firm and slightly rushed, as though the writer had composed it quickly and did not wish to linger over the words. "Miss Hart, the negotiations with the French, Russian, and Chinese delegations require further sessions over the coming weeks. Your services proved necessary to the continuation of these talks. I am prepared to offer you a temporary position as personal translator to House Ashcombe, with fair payment for your time, until the matter is fully resolved. If you are willing, please present yourself at the manor tomorrow at noon. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe." Elena read the letter twice, searching the careful words for any hint of apology, but found none. The Duke had written exactly what was necessary and nothing more. Still, she noticed the phrase, "Your services proved necessary," and something about it made her lips curve into a small, satisfied smile. It was not an apology, but it was an admission, and from a man like the Duke, she suspected that was as close as she would get. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket before returning inside to tell her mother the news. Her mother's eyes brightened at the mention of fair payment, since their small savings had grown thin over the past winter, and the promise of steady income for even a few weeks would ease a great deal of worry. The next day, Elena arrived at Ashcombe Manor precisely at noon, dressed in the same simple gray gown she had worn before, though this time she walked through the front doors with a different kind of confidence. She was greeted not by the nervous steward Edmund, but by the Duke himself, standing near the entrance hall as though he had been waiting for her arrival, though he tried to appear as if he had simply happened to be passing by. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone measured, careful, nothing like the dismissive voice she had heard days earlier. "Thank you for coming." Elena inclined her head politely. "Your letter mentioned payment, Your Grace. I assumed the matter was settled." A flicker of something crossed his face, perhaps embarrassment, though he covered it quickly with a cough, and a gesture toward the hallway. "There is a room prepared for our discussions. The delegates will arrive within the hour." As they walked together down the long corridor lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, the Duke seemed unusually quiet, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Elena did not fill the silence with unnecessary chatter. She had learned long ago that some men needed time to work through their own thoughts before speaking them aloud, and she suspected the Duke was one of them. Finally, as they reached the door to the meeting room, he stopped and turned to face her directly. "I misjudged you," he said, the words coming out stiff and awkward, as though he had rehearsed them but still found them difficult to say. "I assumed things about you that were not fair, and I was wrong to speak to you the way I did in front of my guests." Elena studied his face for a long moment. There was no trace of mockery in his expression, only a genuine, if reluctant, honesty. She had expected many possible responses from him, but a direct apology had not been among them. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said simply. "I accept your apology." He seemed to expect her to say more, perhaps to reassure him that it was of no consequence, or to offer some gracious words that would smooth over the awkwardness of the moment. Instead, Elena simply walked past him into the meeting room, leaving him standing in the corridor with his apology accepted, but nothing more given in return. She did not owe him warmth simply because he had finally found his manners. She had learned that lesson many times before, and she was not about to forget it now. The second negotiation session proved even more difficult than the first. Madame Corrette had brought new demands regarding insurance for the shipped goods, insisting on terms that Yuri Sokolov found unreasonable, leading to a heated exchange that required careful handling. Elena moved between the languages with the same skill she had shown before, but this time she also began to notice small details about the Duke that she had missed in the tension of their first meeting. She noticed how he listened carefully to every word she translated, his eyes narrowing slightly whenever a point required careful negotiation, as though he were memorizing every detail for later use. She noticed how he treated his own household staff with a courtesy that seemed almost at odds with the coldness he had shown her at first, thanking Edmund quietly for bringing refreshments, addressing the younger servants by name rather than simply gesturing for them to fetch things. She also noticed the weight he seemed to carry, visible in the way his shoulders tensed whenever a difficult decision needed to be made, the way his jaw tightened when Madame Corrette pushed too hard on a point he considered unreasonable. He was clearly a man used to carrying heavy burdens alone, unaccustomed to sharing the weight with anyone else in the room. By the end of the second session, an agreement had been reached on the insurance terms, thanks in part to Elena's careful wording, that allowed both sides to feel they had won something important. As the delegates gathered their papers and prepared to leave, the Duke lingered near the doorway, watching Elena organize her own notes with quiet efficiency. "You have a gift for finding the right words," he said, his voice softer than before. "Not just translating them, but choosing them carefully enough to keep everyone at the table." Elena looked up, mildly surprised by the compliment. "It is not so different from what a good negotiator does, Your Grace. The words matter as much as the numbers." He nodded slowly, as though turning her words over in his mind. "I have always relied on numbers. Perhaps I have paid too little attention to words." It was the first time she had heard him admit to any kind of weakness, and something about the admission made her look at him differently, if only for a moment. She quickly reminded herself that a single kind sentence did not erase the way he had treated her before, but she also could not deny that he seemed genuinely willing to learn from his mistakes, which was more than she could say for most men of his station. Over the following days, the negotiations continued in a steady rhythm, each session slightly less tense than the last, as the delegates grew more comfortable with the process. Elena found herself spending more time at the manor than she had expected, sometimes staying past the official end of a session to help draft written agreements that needed to be translated into all three languages for the delegates to review overnight. During one such evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded through the tall windows of the manor's library, Elena sat at a long table, surrounded by papers, carefully translating a complicated shipping contract line by line. The Duke entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea, and set one down beside her without a word before taking a seat across the table. "You do not have to stay this late," he said, watching her work. "I could have Edmund handle the final copies in the morning." "Edmund does not speak Russian," Elena replied without looking up from her papers, "and Mr. Sokolov leaves at dawn. If this is not ready by morning, the entire agreement could unravel over a misunderstanding in the wording." The Duke was quiet for a moment, watching the careful, steady movement of her pen across the page. "You take this work very seriously." "I take all my work seriously, Your Grace," she said, finally glancing up at him. "Whether it is translating a treaty between nations, or teaching a village boy his letters, the work deserves my full attention. People depend on it being done well." Something in her words seemed to strike him deeply, though he did not immediately respond. Instead, he sat quietly, sipping his tea, watching her continue her work, with a kind of focused determination he had rarely seen in anyone, let alone in someone whose skills he had so carelessly dismissed only days before. "May I ask you something?" he said eventually. Elena set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "Of course, Your Grace. How does someone from a small village come to speak 6 languages? Most scholars I know struggle to master even 2 or 3, despite years of formal education and expensive tutors." Elena considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "Necessity, mostly. My mother fell ill many years ago, and there was little money for doctors or medicine. I began working odd jobs wherever I could find them, and it happened that many of those jobs involved travelers passing through our village. A French merchant taught me his language in exchange for help with his accounts. A Russian trader taught me his, in exchange for cooking meals during his stay each winter. It was not formal education, Your Grace. It was survival, one conversation at a time." The Duke listened closely, his earlier assumptions about her crumbling further with every word she spoke. He had imagined, without ever truly thinking about it, that skills like hers came only from privilege, from wealthy families who could afford private tutors and expensive schools. He had never considered that such skill could be built instead from hardship, patience, and sheer determination. "I am sorry for what your family has endured," he said quietly. "And I am sorry that I assumed the worst of you, before I ever gave you the chance to prove otherwise." Elena studied him carefully, searching for any trace of pity in his expression. Since pity was the one thing she could not tolerate from anyone, she found none. What she found instead was something closer to genuine respect, mixed with a quiet curiosity that seemed entirely new to him. "Apology accepted, Your Grace," she said again, though this time her voice carried a touch more warmth than it had in the corridor days earlier. "Though I would ask that you judge the next person you meet by their actions, rather than their appearance. It would save everyone a great deal of trouble." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since arriving at the manor. "That seems like reasonable advice. I will try to remember it." They worked together late into the evening, the Duke occasionally offering suggestions on the finer points of the shipping contract, surprising Elena with a sharper understanding of trade law than she had expected from a man who claimed to rely only on numbers. By the time the final copies were complete, the candles had burned low, and a comfortable, unspoken understanding had settled between them, something neither of them fully recognized yet, but something that had not existed between them just a few days earlier. As Elena prepared to leave for the night, gathering her shawl and her small bag of belongings, the Duke walked her to the front doors of the manor, a courtesy he had not extended before. "Thank you for your work tonight," he said, "and for your patience with me, both tonight and before." Elena paused at the threshold, looking back at him one final time. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Hart," he replied, and for the first time, her name sounded different coming from his mouth. No longer a dismissive label attached to someone beneath his notice, but a name spoken with something that resembled genuine respect. As she walked home under the cold night sky, Elena found herself thinking about the evening's conversation more than she expected to, turning over his words, his questions, the careful way he had listened to her answers. She reminded herself firmly that a few kind words and a shared cup of tea did not erase the vast difference between their two worlds, a duke and a village translator. But she could not deny that something had shifted between them, however small, however uncertain it remained. Behind her, in the quiet library of Ashcombe Manor, Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe sat alone for a long while after she had gone, staring at the stack of translated papers she had left behind, each page filled with her careful, precise handwriting. He thought of the 6 languages she carried inside her mind, built not from privilege but from necessity and hard work, and he thought of how easily he had almost let his own pride cost him the chance to know someone truly remarkable. It was a realization that would follow him long after the candles had burned out completely, long into the quiet hours of the night. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm to Elena's days that she had never known before. Each morning she walked the long road from the village to Ashcombe Manor, her bag filled with notebooks and dictionaries she had collected over the years, worn at the edges from constant use. Each evening she walked home again, often after the sun had already dipped below the hills, her mind full of trade terms and careful phrases that needed to satisfy three very different cultures at once. The negotiations had grown more complex as the weeks passed. What had begun as a simple discussion about shipping routes had expanded into a much larger agreement involving warehouses, insurance, seasonal pricing, and even a proposal for a shared trading post near the coast. Madame Corrette pushed hard for favorable terms for her French shipping company. Yuri Sokolov negotiated fiercely for the Russian wool trade, and Mr. Lin quietly worked to secure the best possible deal for his trading house, without ever raising his voice above a calm, measured tone. Elena had become essential to every conversation, not simply as a translator, but increasingly as an advisor, someone the Duke consulted before important decisions, someone whose opinion on tone and wording could shift the entire direction of a negotiation. It was a role she had never expected to hold, and one that filled her with a quiet pride she tried not to let show too openly, for fear of seeming boastful. The Duke, for his part, had changed in ways that surprised even his own household staff. Edmund, the nervous steward who had once trembled under his master's sharp glances, noticed that the Duke now smiled more often, laughed occasionally at small jokes made during breaks in the negotiations, and seemed genuinely interested in the details of the trade discussions, rather than simply demanding results without patience for the process. "He has not shouted at anyone in nearly 3 weeks," Edmund confided quietly to one of the younger maids one afternoon, as they polished silver in the servants' quarters. "Not once. I did not think such a thing was possible." The maid, a cheerful young woman named Grace, giggled softly. "Perhaps Miss Hart has taught him more than just foreign words." Word of the Duke's changed temperament spread quietly through the manor staff, whispered between polishing cloths and shared meals in the kitchen, though none of them spoke of it openly where the Duke or Elena might overhear. Still, the change was noticeable enough that even visitors to the manor began to comment on it, remarking that the once cold and distant Duke Ashcombe seemed almost approachable these days, almost warm. Elena herself noticed the change too, though she was careful not to take too much credit for it in her own mind. She told herself that people simply revealed different sides of themselves under different circumstances, that perhaps the pressure of his title and his responsibilities had simply eased slightly, as the negotiations progressed more smoothly than expected. She reminded herself often that whatever warmth had grown between them during their long evenings working together in the library was likely nothing more than professional respect, the natural result of two people working closely toward a shared goal. Yet there were moments that made such reasoning difficult to maintain. There was the afternoon he had noticed her hands shaking slightly from the cold as she worked near a drafty window, and without a word, he had quietly moved her chair closer to the fireplace before returning to his own seat, as though nothing unusual had happened. There was the evening he had asked, almost shyly, whether her mother's health had improved, remembering details from their earlier conversation that Elena herself had nearly forgotten she had shared. There was the day he had defended her sharply to a visiting nobleman who made a careless remark about hiring common help for such important matters, his voice suddenly cold and dangerous, in a way that had nothing to do with Elena's abilities, and everything to do with protecting her from unfair judgment. These small moments accumulated slowly, like drops of water filling a basin, until Elena could no longer pretend that what existed between them was purely professional. She did not know what to call it, and she was not entirely sure she wanted to name it at all, since naming it would mean acknowledging a truth that could only lead to complications neither of them could easily navigate. One particular afternoon, during a break between negotiation sessions, Elena found herself walking through the manor's gardens, needing fresh air after hours spent hunched over complicated legal documents. The garden was well kept, filled with roses that had begun to bloom, despite the lingering coolness of early spring, and she walked slowly along the stone path, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. She did not expect to encounter the Duke there, but she found him sitting on a stone bench near the far end of the garden, a book open in his lap, though his eyes were fixed somewhere in the distance, clearly not reading at all. He looked up as she approached, and for a brief moment, something unguarded passed across his face before he composed himself into his usual measured expression. "Miss Hart," he said, setting the book aside. "I did not expect anyone to interrupt my solitude." I can leave you to it, Your Grace, Elena replied, though she made no move to turn away. Please, stay, he said quickly, then seemed almost embarrassed by his own eagerness. That is, if you have no other pressing matters. Elena sat down on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them, though the garden felt smaller somehow, more intimate than the grand halls and formal meeting rooms where they usually spent their time together. You seemed troubled, she said carefully. Is something wrong with the negotiations? No, he said, shaking his head. The negotiations are proceeding better than I ever expected, thanks largely to you. This is a different matter entirely, one that has nothing to do with trade or treaties. Elena waited quietly, sensing that he needed time to gather his thoughts before speaking further. After a long pause, he continued, his voice lower than usual, as though he were sharing something he rarely spoke of aloud. My mother has begun arranging a marriage for me, he said. To Lady Camille Whitmore, daughter of an old and wealthy family, whose estate borders our own to the east. It would be, by every practical measure, an excellent match. Her family's wealth would strengthen our own considerably, and the alliance would secure certain political advantages that my mother believes are essential to the family's future. Elena felt something tighten in her chest at his words, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. And what do you believe, Your Grace? He let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture that seemed entirely unlike the composed, controlled man she had first met weeks earlier. I believe that duty often leaves little room for personal preference. I have known since childhood that my marriage would likely be arranged for the benefit of the estate, rather than for any particular affection. It is simply the way things are done in families like mine. That sounds like a lonely way to live, Elena said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of her own words. The Duke looked at her sharply, as though her comment had struck closer to the truth than he was prepared for. It is the life I was born into. I have never known anything different. That does not mean it cannot feel lonely, Elena replied gently. Knowing a thing and feeling a thing are not always the same. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her heart beat faster, despite her efforts to remain composed. You speak as though you understand loneliness quite well yourself. Elena considered her answer carefully before speaking. I have spent much of my life proving myself to people who assumed the worst before I ever said a word. It is a particular kind of loneliness, Your Grace, being seen as less than you are, over and over, no matter how much you accomplish. I am sorry that I once made you feel that way, he said softly. You have apologized already, she reminded him, and I accepted it. There is no need to apologize again. Perhaps I simply need to say it more than once, to be certain it has truly been understood. Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing past the title and the grand manner and the weight of family expectation that pressed down on his shoulders every single day. She saw a man who, despite every advantage his birth had given him, felt just as trapped by circumstance as she often did by her own lack of advantages. It was a strange and unexpected common ground to find between a duke and a village translator, but there it was, undeniable, sitting quietly between them on a garden bench, surrounded by blooming roses. Your mother's plans, Elena said carefully, choosing her words with the same precision she used in her translations. Do they trouble you because of the marriage itself, or because you feel you have no voice in your own future? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he considered it seriously before answering. Both, I suppose. Lady Camille is perfectly pleasant, from what little I have seen of her. I have no particular objection to her as a person. But the thought of spending my entire life bound to someone chosen purely for practical advantage, without any true understanding or connection between us, fills me with a dread I find difficult to explain. Elena nodded slowly, understanding more than she cared to admit. Then perhaps the solution is not to reject duty entirely, but to find a way to honor it, while still holding on to some part of yourself that duty cannot touch. And how would one manage such a thing? He asked, genuine curiosity coloring his voice. Elena smiled faintly. I am not certain, Your Grace. I have never been a duke faced with an arranged marriage, but I have spent my whole life finding small pockets of joy and purpose within circumstances I could not change. My mother's illness, our lack of money, the assumptions people made about me before ever knowing my name. I could not change any of those things, but I could still choose how I responded to them, what I built within the limits I was given. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded in his expression that Elena had not seen from him before. "You are a remarkable person, Miss Hart. I find myself grateful, more than I can properly express, that circumstance brought you into my household, even if the beginning of our acquaintance left much to be desired." Elena felt her cheeks warm at his words, and she looked away briefly, unsure how to respond to such open sincerity from a man who, only weeks earlier, had dismissed her as unworthy of his notice. "Thank you, Your Grace. That means more than you likely realize." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the afternoon sun warming the garden around them, before a servant arrived to announce that the delegates had returned, and the next session was ready to begin. The Duke rose first, offering Elena his hand to help her rise from the bench, a small courtesy that felt far more significant than its simple gesture suggested. As they walked back toward the manor together, side by side, Elena could not shake the feeling that something important had shifted between them in that quiet garden. Something that neither of them had fully named, but something that both of them now carried forward into whatever came next. That evening, after the day's session had ended and Elena had begun the long walk home, she passed by the edge of the eastern estate that bordered Ashcombe Land, the very estate belonging to the Whitmore family that the Duke had mentioned earlier. She paused for a moment, looking toward the distant lights of the Whitmore house glowing faintly against the darkening sky, and felt a strange, unfamiliar ache settle in her chest, one she did not fully understand and was not yet ready to examine too closely. She reminded herself firmly, as she continued her walk home, that whatever warmth had grown between herself and the Duke could never truly amount to anything real. He was bound by duty to his family name, to an arranged marriage that would secure wealth and influence far beyond anything Elena could ever offer him. She was, and would likely always remain, a village translator, skilled and valuable in her work, but fundamentally separate from the world he inhabited, a world of titles and estates and marriages arranged for political advantage rather than genuine affection. Yet even as she told herself these practical truths, she could not fully silence the small, hopeful voice inside her that wondered what might happen if duty and desire were not always destined to remain separate things. Back at Ashcombe Manor, Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe stood at his study window, watching the last traces of Elena's figure disappear down the darkened road toward the village. His mother's letter about the Whitmore marriage sat unopened on his desk, its wax seal still intact, as though he could delay its contents simply by refusing to break the seal. He knew, with a certainty that settled heavily in his chest, that the conversation in the garden had changed something within him, had opened his eyes to a possibility he had never before allowed himself to consider. For the first time in his life, Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe found himself questioning whether duty and happiness truly needed to remain forever separated, or whether, with enough courage, a man might find a way to honor both. News of Lady Camille Whitmore's expected visit arrived at Ashcombe Manor only a few days after the conversation in the garden, delivered by a formal letter from the Dowager Duchess Margaret, the Duke's mother, who had been away tending to family matters at a distant estate for much of the negotiation period. The letter announced that the Duchess intended to return within the week, bringing Lady Camille along for what she described as a proper introduction, long overdue. The Duke read the letter at breakfast, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena, who had arrived early to prepare documents for the day's session, noticed the slight tightening around his eyes as he folded the paper and set it aside without comment. "Is everything well, Your Grace?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "My mother returns next week," he said simply, "with Lady Camille." Elena kept her own expression carefully composed, focusing her attention on the stack of papers in front of her, rather than on the sudden, unwelcome tightness in her own chest. "I see. Shall I prepare a separate schedule for the negotiations that week, to avoid any conflict with your family obligations?" "That would be wise," he said, though something in his tone suggested he found little comfort in the practical arrangement. The following days passed with an undercurrent of tension that had not existed before, though both Elena and the Duke worked hard to maintain their usual professional focus during the negotiation sessions. Madame Corrette, ever perceptive, remarked once in French that the Duke seemed distracted, a comment Elena chose not to translate fully, softening it instead into a gentler observation about fatigue from the long weeks of work. When the day of the Duchess's arrival finally came, Elena found herself present at the manor slightly earlier than usual, having stayed late the previous evening to finish translating a complicated document regarding warehouse storage fees. She was gathering her papers in the small study she had been given to use during her time at the manor, when raised voices drifted down the hallway, one belonging clearly to an older woman, sharp and commanding, the other unmistakably the Duke's own voice, tense in a way Elena had never heard before. She did not mean to listen, but the study's thin walls made it difficult to avoid hearing at least fragments of the conversation. Has been 3 months, Nathaniel, and still no formal proposal to the Whitmore family. Do you understand what such delay suggests to people of good standing? Mother, the negotiations have required my full attention. There has simply been no appropriate time to. There is always time for duty, when duty is properly prioritized. I hear from Edmund that you have spent a great deal of time with the translator hired for these negotiations. A common girl from the village, is that correct? Elena's breath caught in her throat at the sound of her own position being discussed so dismissively, though she forced herself to remain still and quiet, not wanting to reveal her presence. Elena Hart has been invaluable to these negotiations, the Duke replied, his voice suddenly firm in a way that made Elena's heart ache with an emotion she could not fully name. Without her skills, we would likely have lost the entire trade agreement weeks ago. I am certain her skills as a translator are perfectly adequate, the Duchess said coolly, but I trust you understand the difference between valuing someone's professional usefulness and allowing personal fascination to distract you from your responsibilities to this family. I am fully aware of my responsibilities, Mother. Are you? Because from where I stand, it appears my son has spent more time in the company of a village girl than in any meaningful correspondence with the young woman his family has carefully arranged for him to marry. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words that had come before it. Elena remained frozen in the small study, her hands clutching the stack of papers so tightly that the edges began to crease under her grip. She had known, of course, that a duchess would never approve of her son's growing friendship with a translator from the village, but hearing the disapproval spoken so plainly, with such cold certainty, struck harder than she had expected. Eventually, she heard footsteps moving away down the hallway, and the tension in the air seemed to ease slightly, though her own heart continued to pound long after the voices had faded into silence. She gathered the remainder of her papers with hands that trembled slightly, and made her way toward the meeting room where the day's negotiation session was scheduled to begin, forcing her expression into its usual calm composure, despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. The Duke arrived a few minutes later, his own composure visibly strained, though he greeted the delegates with his usual professional courtesy. Throughout the session, Elena noticed him glancing toward her more than once, as though searching for some sign that she had overheard the earlier conversation, though she was careful to give nothing away, focusing entirely on her work as the negotiations continued. It was during a brief pause in the discussions, while the delegates conferred quietly among themselves over a point of disagreement regarding delivery timelines, that the Duke found a moment to approach Elena privately near the window of the meeting room. "Elena," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since she had begun working at the manor, "I owe you an explanation for whatever you may have overheard this morning." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace," she replied, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "Please," he said, his voice low and earnest, "my mother's opinions on the matter of my marriage are her own, shaped by concerns for the family's future that I understand, even if I do not always agree with how she expresses them. They do not reflect my own feelings toward you, nor do they diminish the value of your work here in any way." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of pity or false comfort, and finding instead only sincere concern. "Your mother is not entirely wrong, Your Grace. I am a village translator. You are a duke expected to marry for the benefit of your family's estate. Whatever friendship has grown between us during these negotiations does not change the reality of our different positions in life." "Must reality always be so rigid?" he asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "Must every relationship in my life be dictated entirely by title and estate, with no room left for genuine respect, or friendship, or—" He stopped himself abruptly, as though he had been about to say something he was not yet ready to voice aloud. Elena waited, her heart beating fast, but he did not finish the sentence. Instead, running a hand through his hair and looking away toward the window, his jaw tight with unspoken frustration. "The delegates are ready to resume." Elena said gently, giving him an easy way to step back from whatever precipice he had nearly walked toward. "Shall we continue, Your Grace?" He nodded, composing himself once more, and the session resumed its usual professional rhythm, though the unfinished sentence lingered between them for the remainder of the day, unspoken, but impossible to fully ignore. That evening, as Elena prepared to leave for the village, she encountered Lady Camille Whitmore for the first time, arriving at the manor in an elegant carriage, accompanied by the formidable Duchess Margaret. Lady Camille was, as the Duke had described, perfectly pleasant in appearance, with soft blonde curls arranged carefully beneath a fashionable hat, and a warm, if somewhat reserved smile that suggested good manners rather than genuine enthusiasm. "You must be Miss Hart," Lady Camille said politely, as their paths crossed near the manor's entrance, her voice carrying the practiced charm of someone raised carefully in society's expectations. "The Duke has mentioned your remarkable skills. 6 languages, is that correct?" "Yes, my lady," Elena replied, offering a polite curtsy, despite the strange discomfort she felt at being noticed by the very woman the Duke was expected to marry. "How extraordinary," Lady Camille said, though her tone carried an undertone Elena could not quite identify. Something between genuine admiration and careful assessment, as though she were measuring Elena's worth against some invisible standard. It must be quite a change, working within such elevated circles after a life spent in the village. "It has certainly been an education, my lady," Elena replied carefully, unwilling to give Lady Camille any opening for further probing questions. The Dowager Duchess, standing nearby, watched the brief exchange with sharp, assessing eyes, her expression giving away nothing of her earlier private conversation with her son. "Miss Hart," she said coolly, "I trust your services to this household will conclude promptly once the negotiations are finalized." The message was clear enough, delivered with the polite coldness of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of her household without ever needing to raise her voice. Elena understood immediately that the Duchess intended for her presence at Ashcombe Manor to remain strictly temporary, a necessary inconvenience to be endured only until the trade agreement was complete, after which point Elena would be expected to disappear back into the village and trouble the family no further. "Of course, Your Grace," Elena replied evenly, refusing to let any hint of hurt show in her voice or expression. "My work here is entirely professional, and I have no intention of overstaying its natural conclusion." The Duchess seemed satisfied with this response, offering a brief nod before moving toward the manor's entrance, Lady Camille following close behind, though not before offering Elena one final, curious glance over her shoulder, as though she sensed something more complicated existed beneath the surface of the polite exchange that had just occurred. Elena walked home that evening with a heavier heart than she had carried in weeks. The earlier warmth of the garden conversation, now clouded by the harsh reality of the Duchess's clear expectations, and Lady Camille's poised, practiced presence. She reminded herself firmly, with each step along the familiar road, that whatever connection had grown between herself and the Duke had always existed within borrowed time, a temporary arrangement destined to end the moment the negotiations concluded, and life returned to its proper, expected order. Yet even as she told herself these practical truths, she could not fully release the memory of the Duke's unfinished sentence in the meeting room, the words he had almost spoken before catching himself, the genuine frustration in his voice at the rigid expectations that governed every aspect of his life. She found herself wondering, despite every effort to discourage such thoughts, what he might have said if he had allowed himself to finish that sentence, and what such words might have meant for both of their futures. Back at the manor, as the household settled into evening routines, Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe stood once again at his study window, watching the darkening road toward the village, his mind consumed by thoughts he had spent the entire day trying and failing to suppress. His mother's disapproval weighed on him heavily, as did the polite, practiced presence of Lady Camille, whose company, though pleasant enough, left him feeling nothing close to the genuine warmth and understanding he had come to associate with quiet conversations shared over translated documents and cups of tea gone cold from neglect. He thought of Elena's careful, measured words in the garden, her insistence on finding pockets of joy within circumstances that could not be changed, and he wondered, with growing unease, whether he possessed the same courage she seemed to carry so naturally, the courage to build something meaningful even within the rigid boundaries of a life not entirely his own to control. For the first time since his father's passing had placed the full weight of the dukedom upon his shoulders, Nathaniel found himself questioning not just the practical demands of duty, but the deeper question of what kind of man he truly wished to become, and whether the answer to that question might require a courage far greater than any he had needed before. With the Dowager Duchess now settled at Ashcombe Manor, and Lady Camille visiting frequently, the household took on a new rhythm, one that required Elena to navigate her days with far greater care than before. She arrived earlier each morning to complete her translation work before the Duchess rose from her private quarters, and she made a careful habit of keeping to the study and the meeting room, avoiding the family's private areas of the manor entirely, hoping to minimize any further opportunities for the Duchess's pointed observations. Despite her efforts, the negotiations themselves continued to demand long hours, and it became increasingly difficult to avoid all contact with the Duke outside the formal sessions, particularly as the trade agreement moved into its final and most delicate stage. The three delegations had reached agreement on nearly every major point, but a dispute had arisen over the exact wording of a clause regarding what would happen if goods were damaged during transport, a seemingly small detail that threatened to unravel weeks of careful progress. Madame Corrette insisted on language that placed responsibility firmly on the shipping company regardless of circumstance, while Yuri Sokolov argued that such terms were unreasonable and would discourage any Russian merchant from participating in future trade. Mr. Lin, characteristically quiet, waited patiently for the two other parties to exhaust their arguments before offering a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but seemed, to Elena's careful ear, like the most sensible path forward. Translating the nuances of this disagreement required hours of careful, exhausting work, and by the time a tentative agreement had been reached late one evening, most of the household staff had already retired for the night, leaving only Elena, the Duke, and a few candles burning low in the meeting room to finalize the written terms. "I believe," the Duke said, rubbing his tired eyes as he reviewed the final document, "that we have finally reached an agreement all three parties can accept." "It has been a long road to get here," Elena agreed, setting down her pen and flexing her cramped fingers. "But I believe the compromise Mr. Lin suggested will hold up well, even if tested by unexpected circumstances." The Duke leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that had grown increasingly familiar to Elena over the past weeks, warm and open, in a way that felt entirely different from the cold, dismissive stranger she had first encountered in this very room. "You have done remarkable work these past weeks," he said quietly. "I do not believe this agreement would exist at all without your skill and patience." "You give me too much credit, Your Grace," Elena replied, though a small, pleased smile touched her lips despite her attempt at modesty. "The delegates did the difficult work of finding common ground. I simply made certain everyone understood what the others were actually saying." "That is no small thing," he said. "Understanding, real understanding, is often the hardest thing to achieve between people, whether they speak the same language or 6 different ones." Something in his tone made Elena look up from her papers, sensing that his words carried a meaning beyond the simple context of the negotiations. The candlelight flickered softly between them, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with something unspoken but deeply felt. "Nathaniel," Elena said softly, using his given name for the first time, testing the weight of it on her tongue. "May I ask you something honestly, without concern for how you might respond?" He nodded, seeming almost to hold his breath at the sound of his own name spoken so gently. "Of course. Do you truly intend to marry Lady Camille?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them had dared to voice so plainly before. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the wooden table, as he considered his answer carefully. "My mother has already begun drafting the formal proposal," he said finally, his voice heavy with something between resignation and reluctance. "The marriage would secure the estate's future for generations to come. Lady Camille is kind, well-educated, and entirely suitable in every practical sense." "That is not what I asked," Elena said gently, though firmly. "I asked whether you intend to marry her, not whether it would be practical or suitable." He looked up at her then, his eyes reflecting the candlelight, filled with an honesty he had perhaps not allowed himself to fully acknowledge until this very moment. "I do not know how to answer that question without betraying either my duty or my own heart, Elena. And I fear that whichever answer I give, someone I care for will be hurt by it." Elena Elena's breath caught at his words, at the clear implication behind them, but she forced herself to remain steady, unwilling to push him toward a confession he might not be ready to make, or one that circumstance might not allow him to honor even if he made it. "Duty is important," she said carefully. "I would never ask you to abandon your responsibilities to your family and your estate. But I also believe, as I told you in the garden, that a person can honor duty while still holding on to some part of themselves that duty cannot fully claim." "And what if the part of myself that duty cannot claim," he said quietly, leaning forward slightly, "has come to care for you more deeply than I ever expected, more deeply than seems wise given our circumstances?" The words landed softly, but with tremendous weight, and Elena felt her heart racing as she processed what he had just admitted, spoken plainly at last, after weeks of careful glances and unfinished sentences, and small, meaningful gestures that had gradually built toward this very moment. "Nathaniel," she said softly, "I have tried very hard these past weeks not to let myself feel the same way, knowing how impossible our circumstances make any future between us. But I cannot pretend any longer that I do not care for you as well, more than would be wise for either of us." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared admission settling gently between them, like the last light of the candles burning low on the table. The Duke reached across the table slowly, his hand resting near hers, but not quite touching, as though seeking permission, before closing the final distance between them. Elena did not pull her hand away, but she also did not close the remaining space, her practical mind still warring fiercely with the tender feelings that had grown within her heart, despite every effort to suppress them. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, the question carrying far more weight than its simple words suggested. "I do not know," the Duke admitted honestly. "I know only that I cannot continue pretending my feelings do not exist, nor can I simply abandon the responsibilities that come with my title. Responsibilities that affect not just myself, but the well-being of everyone who depends on this estate for their livelihood." "Then perhaps," Elena said softly, withdrawing her hand gently, though not unkindly, "we must be patient, and careful, and honest with ourselves about what is truly possible, rather than what we might wish were possible in a different, simpler world." The Duke nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her caution, even as it clearly pained him to accept it. "You are, as always, far wiser than I deserve in this moment. I am simply practical, Your Grace," Elena said, though the warmth in her voice softened the formality of the title. "I have had to be, my whole life." They finished the final preparations for the trade agreement, in a quiet, comfortable silence, the earlier tension of their conversation settling into something gentler, an understanding shared between them that neither fully knew how to navigate, but both were unwilling to abandon entirely. When the work was finally complete, the Duke walked Elena to the manor's entrance himself, as had become his habit over the past weeks, though tonight the gesture carried far greater significance than it had before. "Good night, Elena," he said softly at the door, using her given name once more. "Good night, Nathaniel," she replied, and the sound of his name on her lips, spoken with such open tenderness, lingered with him long after she had disappeared into the darkness toward the village. The following days brought the formal signing of the trade agreement, a grand ceremony attended by all three delegations along with several other prominent figures from the region, including, much to Elena's quiet discomfort, both the Dowager Duchess and Lady Camille, seated prominently near the front of the gathered assembly. Elena performed her final duties as translator, with the same careful professionalism she had shown throughout the entire process, ensuring that the formal documents were read aloud and understood correctly by every party present. As the ceremony concluded, and congratulations were exchanged among the delegates, Lady Camille approached Elena directly, her expression carrying the same careful, assessing quality Elena had noticed during their first meeting. "You have accomplished something remarkable here, Miss Hart," Lady Camille said, her tone polite, but carrying an undertone that suggested she was searching for something beneath the surface of Elena's professional composure. "The Duke speaks of your work with great admiration." "Thank you, my lady," Elena replied carefully, unwilling to reveal anything of the private conversation that had passed between herself and the Duke only days before. Lady Camille studied her for a moment longer, her sharp eyes missing little, before offering a small, knowing smile that unsettled Elena more than any direct accusation could have. "I do hope, for everyone's sake, that once your work here concludes, You find your next position equally rewarding, though I imagine village life must feel rather dull after weeks spent among such important company. The comment carried a subtle warning beneath its polite surface, a reminder from Lady Camille that she, too, understood exactly what kind of connection might be forming between Elena and the Duke, and that she had no intention of allowing such a connection to threaten her own carefully arranged future. Elena inclined her head politely, giving nothing away. I have always found meaning in my work, my lady, wherever it takes me. The village has never felt dull to those who know how to find purpose within it. Lady Camille's smile tightened slightly at the response, though she said nothing further, moving instead to rejoin the Dowager Duchess near the front of the hall, leaving Elena standing alone, with an uneasy feeling settling in the pit of her stomach. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the delegates had departed with warm farewells and promises of future cooperation, Elena gathered her final belongings from the small study that had served as her workspace throughout the negotiations. The trade agreement was complete, her official duties at Ashcombe Manor finished, and with that completion came an uncertain future she had not fully prepared herself to face. The Duke found her there, quietly packing her notebooks and dictionaries into her worn bag, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her with an expression heavy with unspoken emotion. "The agreement is signed," he said softly. "Your work here is finished." "Yes," Elena replied, not looking up from her packing, unwilling to let him see the sadness she felt at the thought of no longer having a reason to walk the long road to Ashcombe Manor each morning. "Elena," he said, stepping further into the room, "I do not wish for our acquaintance to end, simply because the formal negotiations have concluded." She looked up at him then, her heart aching with the same conflicting emotions she had carried for weeks now, hope warring fiercely against practical caution. "Nathaniel, your mother has made her expectations very clear, and Lady Camille, whatever her true feelings, understands exactly what is happening between us, even if we have never spoken of it openly to anyone else." "I know," he admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "But I cannot simply let you walk away, as though these past weeks meant nothing, as though what has grown between us does not matter simply because it is difficult, or complicated, or inconvenient for my family's expectations." Elena set down the notebook she had been holding, meeting his gaze directly. "I do not wish to walk away either, Nathaniel. But I also will not be the cause of division within your family, nor will I position myself as some secret arrangement kept hidden away from proper society, while you fulfill your duty to marry Lady Camille. I deserve better than that, and so do you." Her words struck him deeply, and he nodded slowly, understanding the truth and the strength behind them, even as they left him with no easy answers to the difficult situation they both faced. "Then what do you propose we do?" he asked quietly. "I propose," Elena said, gathering the last of her belongings, "that you take the time you need to truly decide what kind of future you want for yourself, free from my presence complicating your judgment. And when you have decided, truly decided, you may seek me out, if that is what you still wish to do." With that, she offered him a final, gentle smile, and walked out through the manor's grand front doors, leaving behind a man whose heart had been irrevocably changed by 6 weeks spent in the company of a woman who spoke 6 languages, and had taught him, without ever intending to, the far more difficult language of honesty, patience, and genuine respect. 3 weeks passed after the signing of the trade agreement, and in that time, Elena returned fully to her quiet life in the village, though it no longer felt quite as familiar as it once had. She resumed teaching the neighborhood children their letters, tended carefully to her mother's needs, and took on small translation jobs for traveling merchants passing through, work that felt suddenly ordinary after the intensity of the negotiations at Ashcombe Manor. She heard nothing from the Duke during those 3 weeks, and she told herself firmly, each night before sleep, that this silence was exactly what she had asked for: time and space for him to consider his future, without her presence complicating his judgment. Still, she could not entirely quiet the small, hopeful part of her heart that watched the road each evening, waiting for a rider who never came. It was her mother, surprisingly, who first raised the subject that Elena had been carefully avoiding. "You have been distracted these past weeks," her mother said one evening, as Elena sat by the fire mending a torn hem, with more concentration than the simple task truly required. Something happened at that manor, something more than simply translating for foreign merchants. Elena's needle paused mid-stitch, though she did not look up. It was demanding work, mother, nothing more. Her mother, frail, but sharp-eyed despite her illness, studied her daughter carefully. Elena, I have known you your entire life. I know the difference between a daughter tired from difficult work and a daughter whose heart is troubled by something she does not know how to name. Elena set down her sewing entirely then, sighing softly. There is a man, mother. A man far above my station, bound by duty to marry someone else. It would be foolish to hope for anything beyond what already passed between us, and yet I find myself unable to stop hoping regardless. Her mother reached across the small space between them, taking Elena's hand gently in her own thin, weathered fingers. Hope is never foolish, my dear, even when circumstances make it difficult. You have built your entire life out of hope and hard work, teaching yourself languages no one expected a village girl to master. If any woman has earned the right to hope for something more, it is you. Elena squeezed her mother's hand gratefully, comforted by the simple wisdom in her words, though the practical concerns of her situation remained just as complicated as before. It was 2 days later that an invitation arrived at their small cottage, delivered by the same rider who had once brought news of Elena's position at the manor. This time, the letter bore an elegant seal and formal handwriting quite different from the Duke's own hurried script. The letter announced a grand celebration to be held at Ashcombe Manor, marking the successful completion of the international trade agreement, an event that would bring together not only the 3 delegations, but also many prominent families from the surrounding region, including, the letter noted specifically, Miss Elena Hart, whose invaluable contribution to the negotiations warranted formal recognition before the assembled guests. Elena stared at the invitation for a long time, torn between excitement at the prospect of seeing the Duke again and deep apprehension about what such a public appearance might mean, particularly given the Dowager Duchess's clear disapproval and Lady Camille's pointed warnings from weeks earlier. Her mother, upon hearing the news, insisted firmly that Elena attend. You earned this recognition through your own skill and hard work, she said. You have nothing to be ashamed of, and no reason to hide from a celebration you helped make possible. With careful preparation and the help of a kind neighbor who lent her a modest but elegant dress in deep blue, Elena arrived at Ashcombe Manor on the evening of the celebration, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervous uncertainty. The manor had been transformed for the occasion, its grand hall filled with candlelight, fresh flowers, and the elegant chatter of gathered nobility, along with the familiar faces of Madame Corrette, Yuri Sokolov, and Mr. Lin, each accompanied by members of their own delegations. The Duke spotted her almost immediately upon her arrival, and Elena watched as something warm and unmistakable lit up his expression before he composed himself into the more measured demeanor expected of a host greeting his guests. He made his way toward her through the crowded hall, though several other guests stopped him along the way to offer congratulations on the successful trade agreement. You came, he said simply, once he finally reached her side, his voice carrying quiet relief. You invited me, Elena replied, offering a small smile. It would have been rude to refuse. I am glad you did not, he said, and for a moment, the formal distance expected between a duke and a village translator seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by the same easy warmth that had grown between them during their long weeks working together. Their reunion, however brief, did not go unnoticed. Across the hall, the Dowager Duchess watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, her expression carefully composed but unmistakably displeased. Beside her, Lady Camille observed the scene with equal attention, her earlier polite warnings to Elena clearly not having achieved their intended effect. As the evening progressed, the Duke made a point of formally acknowledging Elena's contribution to the negotiations before the assembled guests, raising a toast in her honor that brought polite applause from most of the room, along with genuine warmth from the 3 delegations who understood, better than anyone else present, exactly how essential Elena's skills had been to the agreement's success. Without Miss Hart's remarkable command of 6 languages, the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, this agreement would not exist. I owe her a debt of gratitude that I do not believe can ever be fully repaid. Madame Corrette, Yuri Sokolov, and Mr. Lin each raised their glasses enthusiastically, their genuine respect for Elena evident to everyone watching. But not everyone in the room shared their enthusiasm, and it was not long before the whispered comments began circulating among the more judgmental members of the gathered nobility. A village girl, Elevated to such prominence, one older woman murmured to her companion, just loud enough for Elena to overhear as she passed nearby. How very unusual for the Duke to make such a public display. I hear she taught herself those languages through nothing more than desperate necessity, another guest added, his tone carrying obvious condescension. Hardly the same as proper education. Elena kept her composure despite the sting of these comments, having grown accustomed over the years to enduring such judgment from those who valued birth and title over genuine skill and hard-earned knowledge. She reminded herself firmly that the opinions of strangers who knew nothing of her true worth mattered far less than the respect she had earned from those who had actually witnessed her abilities in action. It was Lady Camille, however, who delivered the evening's sharpest blow, choosing a moment when a small crowd had gathered near Elena to approach with a smile that carried far more malice than warmth. "Miss Hart," Lady Camille said, her voice pitched perfectly to carry across the surrounding group, "I must say, it is truly remarkable how far a person can rise despite such humble beginnings. Tell me, is it true that your mother once worked as a washerwoman before her illness?" The comment landed with deliberate cruelty, designed to remind everyone present of Elena's low birth, and to draw attention to circumstances she had never hidden, but had also never wished to have paraded before a room full of judgmental strangers. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed, refusing to give Lady Camille the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "My mother has worked hard her entire life to provide for our family, my lady," Elena replied evenly. "I have never seen any reason for shame in honest labor, whatever form it takes." "Of course not," Lady Camille said sweetly, though her eyes glittered with unmistakable satisfaction at having struck a nerve. "It is simply so refreshing to see someone from such circumstances, mingling so comfortably among proper society. One almost forgets the difference, until reminded of it." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the small crowd, and Elena felt the familiar, painful weight of being reduced once again to nothing more than her humble origins. Despite every skill and accomplishment she had worked so hard to build, she opened her mouth to offer a measured, dignified response. But before she could speak, another voice cut sharply across the gathered group. "Lady Camille," the Duke said, his voice carrying an edge of controlled anger that silenced the surrounding conversation immediately, "I would remind you that Miss Hart's origins have nothing to do with her remarkable abilities. Abilities that saved this entire negotiation from certain failure. Perhaps you might consider whether such origins deserve admiration rather than mockery, given what she has accomplished despite them." The hall fell into stunned silence at the Duke's public rebuke, delivered without hesitation and with unmistakable protective intensity. Lady Camille's confident expression faltered visibly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at being corrected so publicly by the very man her family had arranged for her to marry. "Your Grace," she said stiffly, "I meant no offense. I was simply—" "You were simply attempting to embarrass a woman whose only fault is coming from circumstances different from your own," the Duke interrupted, his voice still carrying that same controlled but unmistakable anger. "I would ask that you refrain from such comments in the future, particularly while a guest in my home." The Dowager Duchess appeared at Lady Camille's side almost immediately, her sharp eyes moving between her son and Elena, with an expression that promised a far more private and severe conversation once the guests had departed. "Nathaniel," she said quietly but firmly, "perhaps this is not the appropriate moment for such a public discussion." "On the contrary, Mother," the Duke replied, his gaze not wavering from Lady Camille's flustered expression. "I believe it is precisely the right moment. I will not stand by silently while someone I respect deeply is mocked for accomplishments that most people in this room could never hope to achieve themselves." The phrase, "someone I respect deeply," seemed to carry weight far beyond its simple words, and Elena watched as understanding dawned slowly across the faces of several guests, murmurs beginning to spread through the hall as people began to piece together the true nature of the connection between the Duke and his former translator. Elena, mortified by the public attention now focused so intensely upon her, touched the Duke's arm gently, a silent request for him to ease the tension before the situation escalated further. He seemed to understand her unspoken plea, taking a slow breath and stepping back slightly, though his protective posture remained evident to everyone watching. "I believe," Elena said quietly but clearly, addressing the room with the same calm composure she had used throughout the entire negotiation process, that we have all had a long and eventful evening. Perhaps we might return our attention to celebrating the success of the trade agreement that brought us together in the first place, rather than dwelling on matters of birth and circumstance that ultimately have little bearing on genuine accomplishment. Her measured words, delivered with quiet dignity rather than anger, seemed to ease some of the tension in the room, and several guests nodded in agreement, clearly relieved to move past the uncomfortable confrontation. Madame Corrette, standing nearby, raised her glass once more in Elena's direction, a small gesture of solidarity that helped shift the mood of the gathering back toward its original celebratory purpose. Lady Camille, however, excused herself quietly from the group, her earlier confident smile replaced by visible humiliation as she retreated toward a quieter corner of the hall, the Dowager Duchess following close behind, no doubt to offer whatever comfort or strategy might help salvage the evening's damaged pride. As the celebration gradually returned to its intended tone, the Duke found a moment to speak privately with Elena, near a quiet alcove away from the main gathering. "I am sorry," he said softly. "I did not intend for this evening to become such a public spectacle." "You defended me," Elena replied, her voice carrying quiet wonder, despite the earlier discomfort of the confrontation. "Publicly, without hesitation, in front of your own mother, and the woman your family expects you to marry. I could not stand by and watch you humiliated," he said simply. "Not when you have given so much to this household, and not when my feelings for you have grown far beyond what mere gratitude alone could explain." Elena felt her heart racing at his words, spoken plainly now without any of the earlier hesitation that had characterized their private conversations weeks before. "Nathaniel, your mother witnessed everything, Lady Camille as well. There will be consequences for what happened here tonight." "I am aware," he said, his expression serious but resolute. "And I am prepared to face whatever consequences arise from finally being honest about my own heart, rather than continuing to hide behind duty and expectation, as though they were the only things that mattered in my life." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any hesitation or doubt, and finding instead only quiet determination. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever difficult conversations would need to be had with his mother and with Lady Camille's family, clashed. The Duke seemed finally, truly ready to confront them honestly, rather than continuing to hide his true feelings behind the safe distance of formal titles and careful propriety. As the evening drew to a close and guests began departing into the cool night air, Elena walked toward her own modest carriage, arranged by the Duke himself for her comfortable return to the village. Before she climbed inside, he caught her hand gently, holding it for a brief, meaningful moment. "This is not the end of our story, Elena," he said quietly. "Whatever difficulties lie ahead, I intend to face them, and I hope, if you are willing, that you might face them alongside me." Elena looked into his eyes, seeing there the same honesty and determination that had first surprised her weeks earlier, during their quiet conversation in the garden. "I am willing, Nathaniel, but we must both be prepared for what comes next, for your mother's disapproval will not fade easily, and Lady Camille's family may demand answers that complicate matters further than either of us can currently predict." "I understand," he said, squeezing her hand gently before releasing it. "But for the first time in my life, I find myself more afraid of losing you than of disappointing my family's expectations. That fear, I believe, tells me everything I need to know about which path I must choose." As Elena's carriage pulled away from Ashcombe Manor and began the familiar journey back toward the village, though she found herself smiling, despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, comforted by the knowledge that whatever challenges the coming days would bring, she would not face them entirely alone. The days following the celebration brought exactly the kind of turmoil Elena had feared, though it unfolded with a quiet intensity rather than open confrontation. Word of the Duke's public defense spread quickly through the surrounding estates, carried by servants and guests alike, until it seemed that every household within a day's ride had heard some version of the story, each retelling adding new embellishments to what had actually occurred. At Ashcombe Manor itself, the atmosphere grew tense in ways that affected everyone, from the Dowager Duchess down to the youngest kitchen maid. Edmund reported quietly to Elena, during a brief visit she made to collect a small item she had left behind after the celebration, that the Duchess had remained locked in private conversation with her son for nearly 2 hours the morning after the party, their raised voices occasionally audible even through the thick walls of the family study. "He has not backed down, Miss Hart," Edmund said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. "Whatever his mother says to try and change his mind, he simply will not budge on the matter." Elena appreciated Edmund's loyalty in sharing such information, though the news left her with a heavy, conflicted heart rather than simple relief. She understood better than most the weight of family expectation, the way duty could feel like an inescapable current, pulling a person toward a destination they had never truly chosen for themselves. She did not wish to be the cause of such deep division within the Duke's family, however much her own heart had come to care for him. Meanwhile, word arrived that the Whitmore family, upon hearing of the incident at the celebration, had grown deeply displeased, viewing the Duke's public rebuke of Lady Camille as both a personal insult and a threat to the carefully planned marriage alliance between their two families. A formal letter arrived at Ashcombe Manor from Lord Whitmore himself, demanding clarification regarding the Duke's intentions and warning, in carefully diplomatic but unmistakably firm language, that further delay or public embarrassment would force his family to reconsider the entire arrangement. The Duke, torn between his growing feelings for Elena and the very real consequences such feelings threatened to bring upon his family's financial and political standing, found himself caught in a struggle that seemed to have no easy resolution. He visited Elena at the village cottage twice during this difficult period, each visit filled with earnest reassurances that he had not changed his mind, that he remained committed to finding a way forward that honored both his duty and his heart. But Elena, watching him grow increasingly weary and burdened with each passing day, began to notice something troubling in his demeanor, a hesitation that had not been present during the confident declaration he had made at the celebration. It was during his second visit, as they sat together in the small garden behind her mother's cottage, that Elena finally addressed the growing doubt she had sensed building within him. "Nathaniel," she said gently, "you seem troubled beyond what even these difficult circumstances would normally explain. Please, be honest with me. What is truly weighing on your mind?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands rather than meeting her eyes, a posture so unlike his usual confident bearing that it filled Elena with immediate concern. "My mother has explained, in great detail, the financial difficulties the estate has quietly faced these past several years," he said finally, his voice heavy with reluctant honesty. "Difficulties I was aware of in general terms, but had not fully understood the severity of until this week. The marriage to Lady Camille was never simply about political alliance, Elena. It was arranged specifically because the Whitmore family's wealth would prevent the eventual collapse of our own estate, a collapse that would leave hundreds of tenant families without homes or livelihoods." Elena felt her heart sink at his words, understanding immediately the impossible position he now faced, a choice not simply between duty and personal happiness, but between his own heart and the well-being of countless families who depended entirely on the estate's continued financial stability. "I see," she said quietly, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of what he had just revealed. "I do not know what to do," he admitted, finally looking up to meet her gaze, his eyes filled with genuine anguish. "I care for you more deeply than I have ever cared for anyone in my life, Elena. But I cannot, in good conscience, allow my own happiness to come at the cost of so many people's security and well-being." Elena sat quietly for a long moment, processing the full weight of what he had shared, her practical mind already working through the implications, even as her heart ached at the direction the conversation seemed to be heading. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the pain building within her chest, "the answer has already become clear, even if neither of us wishes to fully acknowledge it." "Elena, please, do not." "Nathaniel," she interrupted gently but firmly, "I told you before that I would not be the cause of division or hardship within your family. I meant those words then, and I mean them still now, even more so given what you have just told me. If your marriage to Lady Camille truly stands between the continuation of your estate and the well-being of the many families who depend upon it, then I cannot in good conscience ask you to choose differently, however much it may pain us both." Tears gathered in her eyes despite her best efforts to remain composed, and the Duke reached for her hand, though she gently withdrew it, knowing that further physical comfort would only make the difficult decision ahead more painful for them both. "There must be another way," he said desperately. "Some solution that does not require sacrificing everything we have built between us these past months." "Perhaps there is," Elena said softly, though her voice carried little genuine conviction. but I do not believe either of us is positioned to find it, while our hearts remain so entangled in the outcome. You need clarity, Nathaniel, clarity that only comes from stepping back and viewing your circumstances without the complication of my presence influencing every decision. Are you saying you wish to end things between us? He asked, his voice breaking slightly on the question. I am saying, Elena replied, her own voice trembling despite her efforts at composure, that I love you enough to want you to make this decision freely, based on what truly serves the greater good of everyone who depends upon you, rather than based on any obligation you might feel toward preserving what has grown between us these past months. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken aloud for the first time by either of them, though its weight only deepened the sorrow of the moment rather than offering any comfort. I love you too, Elena, the Duke said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. More than I have ever loved anything or anyone in my entire life, and that is precisely why this decision feels so impossible to make. They sat together in painful silence for a long while, the small garden around them offering no answers to the impossible situation they faced. Eventually, the Duke rose to leave, his shoulders heavy with the weight of an impossible choice that seemed to have no resolution, that would not cause deep pain to someone he cared for. I need time, he said finally. Time to think, to consult with my mother's advisors about the estate's true financial position, to understand fully whether any alternative path exists that might spare us from this impossible choice. Take whatever time you need, Elena replied softly. I will be here, whatever you decide. But even as she spoke these words of patient support, a quiet certainty had already begun forming within her own heart, a decision that felt increasingly inevitable the longer she considered the full weight of the situation. She could not, in good conscience, allow her presence to continue complicating a decision that affected so many lives beyond her own and the Duke's personal happiness. Over the following week, Elena watched the Duke grow increasingly consumed by meetings with financial advisors, correspondence with distant relatives who held partial claims on certain estate properties, and careful calculations regarding exactly how severe the family's financial difficulties truly were. He visited her twice more during this period, each visit shorter and more strained than the last, his exhaustion and growing despair evident, despite his efforts to maintain hope for some alternative solution. It was during his final visit, when he arrived looking more defeated than Elena had ever seen him, that she finally understood the full truth of their situation. The numbers do not lie, he said heavily, sitting across from her in the small cottage's modest sitting room. Without the Whitmore family's investment, the estate will struggle to maintain even its basic obligations within 3 years. Tenant farms will fail, servants will lose their positions. The consequences would ripple outward through the entire region, affecting hundreds of people who have never done anything to deserve such hardship. Elena listened quietly, her heart breaking with each word, though she had already prepared herself for this exact outcome over the preceding days. Then you must marry Lady Camille, she said softly, forcing the words out, despite how deeply they wounded her own heart to speak. Elena, I cannot simply abandon what we— You must, she interrupted gently, but firmly. Not because I wish it, Nathaniel, but because it is the right choice, the choice that protects far more people than just the two of us. I have always believed that true love means wanting what is best for the person you care for, even when that means sacrificing your own happiness for theirs. Tears now fell freely down both their faces, the weight of the impossible situation finally breaking through the careful composure they had both tried to maintain throughout the difficult conversation. I do not know how to simply stop loving you, the Duke said, his voice breaking completely now. I do not know how I am meant to marry another woman while my heart remains entirely devoted to you. You will find a way, Elena said, though her own voice trembled with equal emotion. Because that is what duty requires. And because the well-being of hundreds of families matters more than the personal happiness of just 2 people, however deeply we may care for one another. That evening, after the Duke had finally departed, his shoulders bent with a sorrow that mirrored her own, Elena sat alone in the small cottage, staring into the dying embers of the fire, her decision now fully and painfully clear in her own mind. She would not remain in the village, close enough to occasionally cross paths with the Duke and his new wife, close enough to torture herself with glimpses of the life she could never have. She would leave, build a new life somewhere far from Ashcombe Manor, somewhere she could begin the difficult process of healing, without the constant reminder of what she had given up for the greater good. The following morning, she wrote a careful letter to Edmund, thanking him for his kindness during her time at the manor, and explaining that she intended to seek opportunities in a distant city, perhaps London or Bristol, where her skills as a translator might prove valuable to merchants engaged in international trade. She did not write directly to the Duke, unable to trust herself to compose such a letter without breaking down entirely, but she trusted Edmund to share the news gently, in whatever way he felt appropriate. She began packing her few belongings that same evening, her mother watching with tearful but understanding eyes, offering quiet comfort, even as she, too, grieved the difficult path her daughter felt forced to choose. "You are doing a brave thing," her mother said softly, helping fold Elena's few dresses into a worn traveling bag. "Sacrificing your own happiness, for the sake of people you have never even met." "I am not certain it is bravery, Mother," Elena replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. "It feels more like simple necessity, the only choice that does not leave a trail of destruction behind it." "Sometimes," her mother said gently, "necessity and bravery look remarkably similar from the outside, even when they feel entirely different from within." Elena finished her packing late into the night, planning to depart at first light the following morning, before her resolve could weaken further, before the temptation to seek out the Duke one final time could overwhelm her careful, painful decision. She lay awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling of the small room she had slept in her entire life, wondering whether she was making the right choice, wondering whether love truly required such complete and total sacrifice, or whether some other path might still exist that neither she nor the Duke had yet discovered. But as dawn approached and the first gray light began filtering through her small window, Elena rose from her bed with quiet, resolved determination, gathering her belongings and preparing to leave behind everything that had grown between herself and Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe over the past several months. A chapter of her life she would carry in her heart forever, but one she believed, with painful certainty, needed to end for the sake of everyone involved. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe did not sleep at all the night after his final conversation with Elena. He sat alone in his study long past midnight, the fire burning low, staring at the same financial documents he had reviewed a dozen times already, searching desperately for some overlooked detail that might offer a way forward he had not yet considered. His mother's advisors had been thorough in their assessment, and every path seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. Without significant new investment, the estate's tenant farms and household staff would face genuine hardship within a few short years. It was near dawn, as exhaustion finally began pulling at the edges of his focus, that his eyes fell upon a stack of papers he had nearly forgotten, tucked beneath the financial reports, copies of the trade agreement itself, along with correspondence that had arrived over the past week from Madame Corrette, Yuri Sokolov, and Mr. Lin, each expressing continued enthusiasm about the success of their new trading arrangement and interest in expanding the partnership further in the coming year. He picked up Mr. Lin's letter first, rereading it carefully, and something in the careful, formal wording caught his attention in a way it had not during his first exhausted reading days earlier. Mr. Lin had written not simply to express satisfaction with the agreement, but to propose a further partnership, one that would involve direct investment in expanding trade operations through Ashcombe lands, given the excellent reputation the Duke had earned through the fair and skillful handling of the initial negotiations. Nathaniel sat up straighter, his exhaustion suddenly forgotten, as his mind began working through the implications of what he was reading. He quickly located Yuri Sokolov's letter as well, which contained similar language, expressing interest in establishing a more permanent trading relationship that would involve regular commerce flowing directly through Ashcombe's own lands and warehouses, rather than through intermediary ports. By the time he reached Madame Corrette's letter, his heart was pounding with a growing sense of hope he had not allowed himself to feel in days. She, too, expressed interest in a more permanent arrangement, suggesting that her shipping company would be willing to invest directly in improving Ashcombe's coastal facilities in exchange for preferential trading rights over the coming decade. Nathaniel rose from his desk, pacing quickly across his study as the full picture began forming in his mind. 3 separate trading partners, each expressing genuine interest in investing directly in his estate's infrastructure and ongoing commerce, investments that, combined together, might well exceed the value the Whitmore family's dowry would have provided, and without any of the personal sacrifice that marriage to Lady Camille would require. He immediately summoned Edmund, despite the early hour, and together they began calculating the potential value of the three proposed partnerships, cross-referencing the figures against the estate's actual financial needs, as outlined by his mother's advisors. The numbers, when properly analyzed, told a story remarkably different from the desperate conclusion he had reached only days earlier. "Your Grace," Edmund said, his voice filled with growing excitement as the calculations became clearer. "If these three partnerships are formalized as proposed, the estate would not merely survive its current difficulties, but could potentially thrive beyond anything achieved in recent memory." "And all of this," Nathaniel said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn fully upon him, "exists only because Elena Hart walked into this manor and refused to let a room full of powerful men and women misunderstand one another." He thought immediately of Elena's letter to Edmund, mentioned only briefly the previous evening, when Edmund had gently informed him of her intention to leave the village entirely, seeking new opportunities in a distant city. Nathaniel's blood ran cold at the realization of how close he had come to losing her permanently, based on a desperate financial calculation that had failed to account for the very opportunities her own remarkable skills had helped create. "When does she intend to depart?" he asked urgently. "Her letter mentioned first light this morning, Your Grace," Edmund replied, his own excitement now tinged with concern at the growing urgency in the Duke's expression. Nathaniel glanced toward the window, where the first pale traces of dawn were already beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Without another word, he rushed from his study, calling for his fastest horse to be saddled immediately, his heart pounding with a desperate hope that he was not already too late. Meanwhile, at the small cottage in the village, Elena had finished her final preparations for departure, her worn traveling bag packed and waiting by the door, as the first gray light of dawn crept slowly across the horizon. She embraced her mother tightly, both of them fighting back tears as they said their goodbyes, though Elena had promised faithfully to write often, and to send for her mother once she had established herself securely in her new life. "Are you certain about this, my dear?" her mother asked one final time, searching her daughter's tired, sorrowful face for any sign of hesitation. "I am certain it is the right thing to do," Elena replied, though her voice carried little genuine conviction beneath the practiced determination she had forced herself to maintain throughout the difficult night. "Whether it is what I truly wish to do is an entirely different question, Mother. One I have decided does not matter as much as doing what is right." She stepped outside into the cool morning air, her bag slung over her shoulder, ready to begin the long walk toward the main road, where she hoped to find a merchant's cart willing to carry her toward the nearest city. She had taken only a few steps down the familiar path when the sound of rapid hoofbeats reached her ears, growing louder with each passing second. Elena turned, her heart leaping unexpectedly at the sight of a familiar figure racing toward her on horseback, his coat flying behind him in the wind, his expression a mixture of desperate urgency and barely contained hope. Nathaniel pulled his horse to a stop just a few feet from where she stood, dismounting quickly and closing the remaining distance between them with rapid, purposeful strides. "Nathaniel, what are you—" "Do not leave," he said breathlessly, cutting off her question entirely. "Please, Elena, before you take another step toward that road, you must hear what I have discovered." Elena stood frozen, her bag still slung over her shoulder, watching him with cautious hope as he struggled to catch his breath after the hard ride. "The trading partners," he continued, still breathing heavily, but unable to contain his excitement any longer. "Madame Corrette, Yuri Sokolov, Mr. Lin. All three have written expressing interest in further investment, directly in Ashcomb's estate and infrastructure. Combined together, their proposed investments would more than cover the financial needs my mother's advisors identified, without requiring any marriage to the Whitmore family whatsoever." Elena's bag slipped from her shoulder, forgotten entirely as she processed the full weight of what he was telling her. "Nathaniel, are you certain? This is not simply hope speaking, rather than careful calculation. Edmund and I spent the entire night reviewing the figures," he assured her, his voice steadying now as his breathing calmed. "The numbers are sound, Elena. Your work, your skill in bringing these three delegations together successfully, has created an opportunity that not only saved this initial negotiation, but may well save this entire estate from the very crisis that nearly forced me to abandon everything I truly wanted." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though this time they carried hope rather than sorrow. "Then you no longer need to marry Lady Camille?" "I never wished to marry Lady Camille," he said firmly, taking her hands in his own, his eyes filled with an intensity she had never seen from him before. I only believed I had no other choice. That duty required a sacrifice I was prepared to make, however painful, for the sake of people who depended upon this estate's continued prosperity. But now, with this new path forward, I am free to choose differently, and there is only one choice I wish to make. He knelt then, right there on the simple dirt path outside her mother's cottage, still holding her hands gently in his own, his expression filled with a vulnerability and openness that stripped away every trace of the cold, dismissive Duke she had first encountered so many months earlier. "Elena Hart," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air, "I love you more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone. You have taught me that true worth has nothing to do with birth or title, and everything to do with character, skill, and the courage to speak truth, even when silence would be easier. I am asking you, with everything my heart possesses, to stay, to build a life alongside me, not as some secret arrangement hidden from society, but openly, proudly, as my equal partner in every sense that truly matters." Elena stared down at him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, her heart overflowing with an emotion so powerful, it left her momentarily unable to speak. Finally she found her voice, though it trembled with the depth of feeling behind her words.
"Yes," she said softly.
"Yes, Nathaniel, I will stay. I will build this life alongside you, whatever challenges it may bring." He rose immediately, pulling her into an embrace that held all the desperate relief and overwhelming joy of a man who had come dangerously close to losing everything that truly mattered to him. They stood together for a long moment in the quiet morning light, neither willing to release the other, the weight of the past difficult days finally beginning to lift from their shoulders. Their reunion, however, was not yet complete, for there remained the matter of formally ending the arrangement with the Whitmore family, a conversation that would need to happen before the Dowager Duchess and the assembled household staff at Ashcombe Manor. Nathaniel insisted that Elena accompany him back to the manor immediately, wanting her present when he formally addressed his mother about the change in his circumstances and intentions. They arrived together at Ashcombe Manor just as the household was beginning its morning routines, and Nathaniel led Elena directly toward his mother's private sitting room, where the Dowager Duchess was already awake, reviewing correspondence over her morning tea. She looked up in surprise as her son entered, Elena following close behind him, both of their expressions carrying a determination that immediately put the Duchess on alert. "Nathaniel, what is the meaning of—" "Mother," he interrupted, his voice calm but absolutely resolute. "I have come to inform you that I will not be marrying Lady Camille Whitmore. The financial concerns that made such a marriage seem necessary have been resolved through alternative means, specifically through the continued trading partnerships established during the recent negotiations. Partnerships that exist entirely because of Elena's remarkable skill and dedication." The Dowager Duchess set down her teacup slowly, her sharp eyes moving between her son and Elena with an expression that shifted rapidly from shock to calculation, to something Elena had not expected to see, a grudging, careful consideration of the practical implications behind her son's announcement. "You are certain of these figures?" the Duchess asked finally, her tone still cool, but no longer carrying the dismissive edge Elena remembered from their first difficult encounter. "Entirely certain," Nathaniel replied. "Edmund has reviewed every calculation, and the proposed investments from Madame Corette, Yuri Sokolov, and Mr. Lin more than compensate for what the Whitmore dowry would have provided, without any of the compromises such a marriage would have required." The Duchess was quiet for a long moment, her gaze settling finally on Elena, studying her with an intensity that made Elena want to look away, though she forced herself to meet the older woman's eyes directly, refusing to shrink from the scrutiny. "You have accomplished something remarkable, Miss Hart," the Duchess said finally, her voice carrying a reluctant but unmistakable respect. "I confess, I did not believe such a resolution possible when I first learned of my son's growing attachment to you. I judged you too harshly, based on assumptions about your background that your accomplishments have clearly proven unfounded." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her at these unexpected words, though she remained cautious, uncertain whether the Duchess's approval, however welcome, would prove genuine or merely practical acceptance of an outcome she could not change. "Thank you, Your Grace," Elena replied carefully. "I understand your concerns about your son's future and the estate's well-being. I would never wish to be the cause of hardship for the many people who depend upon this household." "And yet," the Duchess said, a faint, reluctant smile touching her lips for the first time since Elena had known her, "it appears your presence has instead become the very solution to hardship that might otherwise have been unavoidable. I believe, Miss Hart, that I owe you an apology of my own for judging you unfairly before ever giving you the chance to prove your true worth." The formal conversation with the Whitmore family proved considerably more difficult, requiring several tense meetings over the following days between Nathaniel, his mother, and Lord Whitmore himself, who initially expressed considerable displeasure at the broken arrangement. However, once the true financial security of the new trading partnerships became clear, and once it became evident that Lady Camille herself, upon private reflection, felt genuine relief at being released from an arrangement she had never particularly desired for herself, the matter was eventually resolved with far less lasting animosity than anyone had initially feared. Lady Camille, in fact, sought out Elena privately several weeks later, offering a sincere, if somewhat awkward apology for her earlier cruel comments at the celebration. "I behaved poorly," Lady Camille admitted, her earlier polished confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I was frightened, I think, of losing a match my family had worked so hard to arrange, and I took that fear out on you unfairly. I hope, in time, we might find our way toward a more genuine friendship, if you are willing to extend such grace toward me." Elena, never one to hold grudges when genuine remorse was offered, accepted the apology warmly, and over the following months, an unexpected friendship did indeed begin to grow between the two women, each finding in the other qualities they had not initially recognized or appreciated. As for Elena and Nathaniel, their courtship proceeded openly and proudly throughout the following months, with Elena taking on an increasingly formal role within the estate's growing international trade operations, her skills as a translator and negotiator proving invaluable as the partnerships with Madame Corrette, Yuri Sokolov, and Mr. Lin expanded into a thriving, prosperous enterprise that brought new opportunity and stability not only to Ashcombe Manor itself, but to the entire surrounding region. Their wedding, when it finally arrived on a warm summer morning nearly a year after their first difficult encounter in the Manor's Great Hall, was attended by all three of the original trade delegations, each having become genuine friends of both the bride and groom over the intervening months. Madame Corrette wept openly with joy throughout the ceremony. Yuri Sokolov offered a booming, enthusiastic toast in Russian that Elena translated herself with a delighted laugh, and Mr. Lin presented the couple with an elegant gift, along with a few carefully chosen words in Mandarin that Elena translated for the assembled guests. True partnership, like true understanding, requires patience, respect, and the courage to listen carefully to what others have to offer. The Dowager Duchess, standing near the front of the gathered assembly, watched her son marry a woman she had once dismissed as unworthy of his attention, and found herself, to her own considerable surprise, filled with genuine pride and happiness at the union unfolding before her. She had learned, over the preceding months, to see past the simple markers of birth and title that had once governed her every judgment, coming to understand instead that true worth lay in character, skill, and the courage to remain honest even when circumstances made honesty difficult. As Nathaniel and Elena exchanged their final vows before the assembled guests, he could not help but recall the very first words she had ever spoken to him, calm and composed despite his own dismissive cruelty, words that had humbled him completely and set them both upon a path neither could have predicted that difficult evening many months before. "I speak 6 languages, Your Grace," she had told him then, simply and without pride, though the words had carried more power than either of them fully understood in that moment. Now, standing beside her as his wife, surrounded by friends who had become like family, and a mother who had finally learned to see beyond her own narrow expectations, Nathaniel understood at last the true meaning behind those words, and behind everything Elena Hart had shown him about worth, dignity, and the courage required to speak truth, even when the world around you insists on silence. She had never needed his validation to know her own value. She had simply, patiently, and with unwavering dignity, waited for him to recognize it himself, and in doing so, had taught him more about true worth than any lesson his privileged upbringing had ever managed to provide. 2 years into their marriage, Elena and Nathaniel faced a challenge that tested everything they had built together: one that arrived without warning on a stormy autumn evening when a rider from the coast burst into Ashcombe Manor with urgent news. 3 of the trading ships belonging to their joint venture with Madame Corret's shipping company had been caught in a violent storm off the southern coast, and 1 vessel, carrying a mixed crew of English, French, and Russian sailors along with a cargo vital to the season's trade agreements, had run aground near a rocky stretch of shoreline controlled by a suspicious local harbor authority, unfamiliar with any of the international parties involved. Nathaniel read the urgent dispatch with growing alarm, his hands tightening around the paper as he absorbed the details. The local harbor master, unable to communicate clearly with the ship's mixed crew, had detained both the vessel and its cargo, suspicious of foreign sailors speaking languages he did not recognize, and had threatened to seize the goods entirely unless proper documentation could be provided and understood within 2 days, an impossibly tight window given the distance involved. "I must go immediately," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the door to call for horses and a small party of trusted men. "We must go immediately," Elena corrected firmly, already gathering her travel cloak and a satchel containing important documents. "You cannot resolve this alone, Nathaniel. The harbor master speaks only the local coastal dialect, and from what this dispatch describes, the crew includes sailors who speak French, Russian, and likely some Mandarin as well, given Mr. Lin's continued investment in the shipping routes." Nathaniel hesitated only a moment before nodding, recognizing immediately that her presence would prove essential to resolving the crisis swiftly. Within the hour, they departed together on horseback, riding hard through the worsening weather toward the distant coast, accompanied by 2 of the estate's most trusted guards, and Edmund, who insisted on joining despite his limited skill on horseback, determined to assist however he could. The journey proved grueling, with rain lashing against them for much of the ride, and the roads growing increasingly treacherous as they neared the coastline. Elena's arms ached from gripping the reins so tightly, and her cloak offered little protection against the driving wind, but she pressed forward without complaint, her mind already working through the various phrases and diplomatic language she would need to navigate the tense situation awaiting them. They arrived at the small coastal town well after midnight, finding the local harbor in a state of confused tension. The grounded ship sat visible in the distance, its hull tilted awkwardly against the rocks, lanterns flickering aboard as the stranded crew waited anxiously for some resolution to their predicament. On the shore, a group of local officials stood guard near a makeshift holding area where several crew members had been detained, their expressions ranging from frightened confusion to barely contained frustration. The harbor master, a stern man named Mr. Bramwell, approached Nathaniel and Elena with evident suspicion, clearly unaccustomed to receiving visitors of noble standing at such a late hour under such unusual circumstances. "Your Grace," Bramwell said cautiously, recognizing the ash-cone crest on Nathaniel's coat, "I was not expecting your personal involvement in this matter. These foreign sailors have caused considerable disruption to our harbor, and until proper documentation can be verified, I cannot in good conscience release either the vessel or its cargo." "I understand your caution, Mr. Bramwell," Nathaniel replied evenly, "and I appreciate your diligence in protecting this harbor's interests. However, I believe this entire situation stems from a simple failure of communication, rather than any genuine wrongdoing on the part of the crew or cargo owners." He gestured toward Elena, who stepped forward calmly despite her exhaustion from the difficult journey. "This is my wife, Elena Ashcombe, who speaks fluent French, Russian, and Mandarin, along with several other languages. With your permission, she can speak directly with the detained crew members and clarify any misunderstanding regarding the cargo's documentation." Bramwell studied Elena skeptically for a moment, clearly unaccustomed to a noblewoman offering such practical assistance, but the lateness of the hour and his own genuine desire to resolve the disruption quickly won out over any lingering doubt. "Very well," he said. "Follow me." Elena moved quickly toward the holding area, where the detained crew members sat huddled together, cold and frightened after their harrowing ordeal at sea, followed by the confusing detention on unfamiliar shores. She began speaking calmly in French to the nearest group, immediately recognizing relief flood across their exhausted faces at finally being understood. The French sailors explained quickly that the ship's captain, an experienced but injured Russian sailor named Ivan, had been knocked unconscious during the storm and remained unable to communicate the vessel's proper documentation, which was written partially in Russian trade terminology, that none of the local officials could read or verify. Elena moved swiftly to Ivan's side, where he lay resting against the hull, his head wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and spoke gently to him in Russian, asking careful questions about the ship's cargo manifest and its intended destination. Ivan, though weakened from his injury, managed to explain the location of the proper documentation, hidden safely within a waterproof compartment near the captain's quarters, that the frightened crew had been too afraid to access without proper authorization during the chaos of their detention. Elena quickly translated this information for Nathaniel and Mr. Bramwell, and within a short time, the documentation was retrieved and verified, proving conclusively that the cargo belonged legitimately to the established trading partnership between Ashcombe Manor and the 3 international delegations. As dawn began breaking over the storm-battered coastline, Mr. Bramwell, satisfied at last with the verified documentation, ordered the release of both the vessel's cargo and its detained crew, offering a gruff but genuine apology for the misunderstanding that had caused such unnecessary distress to everyone involved. "I must say," Bramwell admitted to Nathaniel as the tense situation finally resolved, "I have never before witnessed a noblewoman handle such a crisis with such practical skill. Most ladies of her standing would have remained safely at home, leaving such matters entirely to their husbands and advisors." "My wife has never been most ladies of her standing," Nathaniel replied with evident pride, watching as Elena continued speaking gently with the exhausted crew members, arranging for medical care for the injured captain and warm shelter for the cold, frightened sailors who had endured such a harrowing night at sea. The grounded ship required several more days of careful repair before it could safely continue its journey, and Elena remained throughout that time, coordinating between the local shipwrights, the ship's mixed crew, and the various trading partners who needed updates on the delayed cargo's status. Her calm, capable presence throughout the crisis earned her lasting respect not only from Mr. Bramwell and the local coastal community, but from the ship's grateful crew, who spoke for months afterward of the remarkable noblewoman who had saved them from an impossible situation through nothing more than her extraordinary command of language and her genuine compassion for their difficult circumstances. When Elena and Nathaniel finally returned to Ashcombe Manor a week later, exhausted but triumphant, they found the household staff, and even the Dowager Duchess, eagerly awaiting news of the crisis's resolution. The Duchess, who had grown considerably warmer toward Elena over the preceding 2 years, embraced her daughter-in-law with genuine affection and relief. "You have once again proven yourself invaluable to this family," the Duchess said warmly. "I confess there was a time, not so very long ago, when I believed your presence here would bring nothing but complication and scandal. I could not have been more mistaken. We make quite a formidable team, Your Grace," Elena replied with a tired but genuine smile, glancing toward Nathaniel, who returned her look with unmistakable love and pride. That evening, as they finally settled into the quiet comfort of their own private chambers after the exhausting ordeal of the preceding week, Nathaniel took Elena's hands gently in his own, studying her face with the same warm admiration he had felt from nearly the very beginning of their acquaintance, though it had taken him far too long to recognize and act upon those feelings. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The path your life has taken, from a quiet village translator to the wife of a duke, facing storms and crises that most women of your original circumstances would never have imagined encountering." Elena considered the question thoughtfully before answering, her mind drifting briefly across the remarkable journey that had brought her from that first tense evening in the manor's great hall to this quiet moment, years later, as a woman fully secure in her own worth and place in the world. "I do not regret a single moment," she said finally, her voice warm with genuine contentment. "Every difficulty, every challenge, every storm we have weathered together has only deepened my understanding of what truly matters in life. It was never about titles or wealth or the approval of society, Nathaniel. It was always about finding someone who saw my true worth and building a life together where that worth could be fully expressed, rather than constantly questioned or diminished." Nathaniel pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers, grateful beyond words for the remarkable woman who had walked into his life on an ordinary evening years before, transforming not only his own understanding of worth and dignity, but the very fortunes of his family's estate and the countless lives that depended upon it. "I speak 6 languages, Your Grace," she had told him once, calmly and without pride, in a moment that had humbled him completely. Now, Years later, standing together as true partners in every sense that mattered, Nathaniel understood that her true gift had never simply been the languages themselves, remarkable as that skill remained, but rather her unwavering commitment to genuine understanding. Patience and courage, qualities that had ultimately taught an arrogant young duke the most important lesson of his entire life, that true worth has nothing to do with birth or title, and everything to do with the character a person builds through their own hard work, dignity, and unshakable honesty, regardless of how the world chooses to judge them at first glance.